Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping quietly into one of the most unsettling stories in American true crime, the life of a man whose gentle voice and polite manner hid a darkness few could ever imagine. Edmund Kemper. Nearly 7 feet tall, intelligent, articulate, and strangely calm. To those around him in 1970s California, he was the soft-spoken giant who held doors open, chatted easily, and blended into normal life. No one suspected he would become one of the most infamous and deeply studied killers in modern history. But long before the world knew him as the co-ed killer, Kemper was a child shaped by isolation, humiliation, and a fractured home. His early wounds, ignored warnings, and growing fantasies formed the path that would eventually lead to fear across Santa Cruz. Tonight, we'll walk through that path, from his troubled childhood to a Atascadero State Hospital, to the mask he learned to wear after release, and the calm storm that followed. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me which country you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always surreal seeing this late-night crime family stretch across the world. So settle in. Let the day fade. And follow me into the quiet streets of 1970s Santa Cruz, where one man lived 2 lives. The polite giant people trusted, and the shadow they never saw. This is True Crime Records. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, there's a new story waiting every night. Chapter 1, Shadows of Childhood, The Making of a Giant. Edmund Emil Kemper III entered the world on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, a place that in the post-war years was wrapped in optimism and suburban promise, yet from the very beginning there was a tension woven quietly through his home that no one spoke about but everyone felt. As the third child of Edmund Kemper Jr. and Clarnell Strandberg, he grew up watching a marriage that seemed to be unraveling one quiet argument at a time, a household where words were sharp and affection was scarce, and where young Edmund learned early that silence was often safer than attention. He was a bright child, deeply observant, surprisingly introspective, and far more aware of adult emotions than any child should have been, but he also felt profoundly out of place. At school, he stood taller than the other children, towering above classmates even before adolescence, and that unusual height made him feel like he didn't fit, like he took up too much space in a world that didn't want him. At home, he felt the sting of rejection from a mother who struggled with her own frustrations and disappointments, frustrations she often directed toward him. She told him he was too much like his father. She told him he was too big, too demanding, too difficult to control. In those early years, her voice became the loudest force in his world, a force that left marks not on his body, but on the quiet places in his mind where a child's sense of worth is meant to grow. His father, a World War II veteran, tried in small ways to protect young Edmund from the worst of the household tension, but the cracks in the marriage deepened, and the emotional distance between the parents widened until the home felt less like a family and more like 2 storms orbiting each other, waiting to break. By the time Edmund was in grade school, the marriage had fractured for good. The divorce left him drifting between 2 parents who couldn't fully see him, one who tried but was already pulling away from domestic life, and one who was overwhelmed by her own bitterness. The separation uprooted his world. He understood the logistics of the divorce, but not the emotional consequences. He knew where he was living, but not why he felt so profoundly alone. During these years, his height continued to accelerate beyond normal growth patterns. Doctors noted it. Teachers noted it. Even strangers commented on it. By age 10, he was over 5 feet tall. By 14, he was taller than most grown men. Children teased him. Adults treated him awkwardly, unsure how to speak to a child who looked like an adult. And Edmund, unsure of how to navigate the space between who he was and how he appeared, retreated deeper into his imagination, building quiet inner worlds where he could decide the rules instead of being subject to them. His intelligence grew alongside his body. He developed a keen sense of observation, a near photographic memory, and an ability to read emotions even when people tried to hide them. But intelligence without guidance is its own kind of burden. Instead of finding mentors or confidence, Edmund found confusion. Instead of finding belonging, he found isolation. And as the emotional landscape of his childhood became colder, he started searching for control anywhere he could find it. Clarnell, his mother, struggled to show warmth, believing that tough love would harden her son into someone strong enough to handle the world. But her harshness didn't toughen him, it alienated him. She would lock him away in the basement at night, telling him that he frightened his sisters, a decision that planted a seed of resentment and confusion that would grow quietly for years. In that dark basement, lit only by a single exposed bulb, Edmund lay awake listening to the sounds of the house above him, the television, the footsteps, the life he felt excluded from. And the separation shaped him. It amplified his loneliness. It nurtured a sense of invisibility. It set the stage for a young boy to drift into a life where emotional disconnection felt normal, even comforting. He started to understand power not as something expressed through confidence or achievement, but as something tied to size, presence, and control, ideas that would later twist into deeply troubling paths. Yet in these early years, Edmund didn't appear outwardly hostile or rebellious. Teachers described him as polite, quiet, sometimes withdrawn. Relatives saw him as helpful and soft-spoken. Even his mother, despite her bitterness, admitted he could be thoughtful. But beneath those surface impressions, the fractures were already forming. And as Edmund moved into adolescence, those fractures deepened into something more complex, an internal divide between the gentle giant the world saw and the unresolved storm growing slowly inside him. As Edmund approached his teenage years, the patterns of his childhood hardened into habits. Silence became his default language, observation became his shield, and a deep sense of loneliness became the rhythm of his daily life. He felt too big for childhood, too misunderstood for adulthood, and too isolated to express the confusion that lived quietly inside him. His relationship with his mother grew increasingly strained as she struggled to manage a son who was now nearly her height and on his way to surpassing every adult in the household. Her frustrations became sharper, her words more biting, her discipline more rigid. The more she tried to exert control, the more Edmund retreated into himself, building mental walls that kept her criticism from overwhelming him but also kept him emotionally distant from everyone else. School wasn't much easier. Teachers recognized his intelligence but noticed his discomfort around peers. Other students either mocked his size or avoided him altogether, leaving him in a limbo where he was too noticed to be invisible and too different to belong. The isolation created a kind of emotional echo chamber, one where thoughts grew louder in the absence of connection, and where frustrations went unspoken and unresolved. The lack of grounding forces in his life, affection, mentorship, stability, left Edmund without a clear sense of identity. He carried the weight of his parents' divorce, the tension of being the problem child, in his mother's eyes, and the confusion of being a physically imposing teenager who still felt like a frightened boy inside. And yet, there were moments when glimpses of his intelligence shined through. He took an interest in reading, especially subjects related to psychology, power, and human behavior. He became fascinated with how people thought, how they acted, how they responded to authority. Teachers were impressed by his analytical mind, but they didn't see the loneliness behind it or the way he used academic curiosity as a replacement for emotional connection. As he continued to grow in physical stature, emotionally he remained stuck, torn between a desire for approval and a fear of rejection. His longing for acceptance, especially from his mother, clashed with the constant criticism he received at home. In time, that internal conflict shaped his understanding of relationships. He viewed emotional closeness as something dangerous, unpredictable, and painful. And with each passing year, he began to see the world through a distorted lens, where control seemed like the only reliable path to safety. His father remained distant, building a new life after the divorce, leaving young Edmund without a stable male figure to look up to. Without guidance, he tried to interpret adulthood through observation, mimicking behaviors he saw in others without feeling them himself. That emotional disconnect, small and fragile at first, grew quietly in the background. By the time Edmund entered high school, he was already taller than most adults, standing at an intimidating presence that didn't match his soft, awkward demeanor. Teachers saw a polite young man. Neighbors saw a quiet boy doing his chores. But beneath that calm exterior was an adolescent who felt powerless, misunderstood, and desperate for autonomy. Slowly, without anyone noticing, that desperation began to solidify into something darker, a desire for control that felt comforting, a sense of inner authority that no one else could give him. And although no one recognized it at the time, the earliest psychological foundations of the co-ed killer were being formed, not through violence or outburst, but through years of isolation, rejection, emotional suppression, and unmet needs. The boy who would one day terrify California was not born a monster. He was shaped, quietly, slowly, and painfully, by a childhood full of shadows. And the deeper those shadows grew, the further Edmund drifted from the man he might have been into the complex figure he would eventually become. Chapter 2: Broken Homes and Early Wounds. Edmund Kemper's teenage years unfolded like a long, heavy winter, quiet, gray, and stretching further than anyone around him realized. After his parents' divorce, the pieces of his life no longer fit together the way they were supposed to. His father drifted further away, building a new life that seemed to erase Edmund from the picture, and his mother, already overwhelmed by her own disappointments, grew harsher, colder, and more unpredictable with her son. She saw him less as a child and more as a reminder of everything she felt she had lost: her marriage, her comfort, her sense of control. Her words seemed aimed at shrinking him emotionally because she couldn't shrink him physically. But the more she tried to contain him, the more Edmund felt himself slipping into a quiet emotional limbo where nothing felt secure and nothing felt safe. Every day in the Kemper household carried a tension he learned to navigate silently. He never knew when a simple question might spark an argument, or when an attempt at normal conversation might turn into a lecture about how he wasn't trying hard enough or thinking correctly or behaving the way a son should. Over time, those patterns chipped away at whatever remained of his confidence, leaving behind a teenager who moved through the house like a guest instead of a member of the family. His mother's resentment became a lens through which he interpreted the world, sharp, unforgiving, and always pointing back at him. School offered little escape. He was too tall, too awkward, too quiet to fit in with most groups, and teachers often didn't know what to do with a boy who looked like a grown man but carried himself with the hesitance of someone trying not to be noticed. Adolescence is confusing for most teenagers, but for Edmund, it was a period shaped by contradictions he couldn't untangle. He wanted connection, yet feared rejection. He wanted approval, yet braced himself for criticism. He wanted to feel understood, yet couldn't express what churned silently inside him. These emotional knots deepened the loneliness he'd carried since childhood. And as the loneliness grew, so did an inner landscape shaped by imagination instead of experience, a quiet world where power and control felt clear in ways real life never did. In a home where warmth was limited, Edmund clung desperately to small pockets of stability. He read constantly, gravitating toward topics adults never expected a teenage boy to understand: human behavior, psychology, power, authority. The more he read, the more he began to question why people acted the way they did, why some seemed to hold power so naturally while he felt powerless in almost every corner of his life. His mother's criticism carved deeper lines into his self-perception, telling him again and again that women didn't like him, that he would never find love, that his size made him frightening and undesirable. Even though these were her fears projected onto him, Edmund absorbed them as truth. And with each passing year, those beliefs hardened into the foundation of his worldview. His sisters grew wary of him, not because of anything he did, but because their mother told them to be. Clarnell insisted that Edmund was strange, that he couldn't be trusted, and that they should keep their distance. Whether she truly believed this or said it out of resentment, Edmund internalized her warnings as another form of exile. He was becoming an outsider in his own family, a young man physically present but emotionally exiled, left alone with thoughts he didn't understand and feelings he couldn't express. The basement became a symbol of this emotional separation. During the nights he was forced to sleep down there, alone, forgotten, surrounded by shadows, he learned to adapt to solitude. In the quiet, he listened to the muffled sounds of the house above him, laughter, arguments, footsteps, doors closing. He heard life happening in a space he wasn't part of. And slowly, that sense of exclusion shaped him more than the words spoken during the day. He became, in many ways, a boy raised by silence. By the time Edmund reached his mid-teens, the emotional wounds from his early childhood had deepened into something more complex. He started to struggle with a sense of duality, one part of him longing deeply for connection, and another part of him building walls to protect himself from the pain connection had always brought. His height and physical presence, which others saw as intimidating, felt like burdens he didn't know how to carry. He didn't want to be frightening. He didn't want to be different. But he felt as though the world kept pushing him into the role of an outsider. And little by little, the emotional distance he felt from others began to shape how he viewed humanity itself, not as a community to join, but as something he observed from afar, like a person standing outside a window watching a life he wasn't invited into. These were the quiet years, years that left no physical scars but shaped the emotional terrain he would walk for the rest of his life. Years where the seeds of disconnection, resentment, fear, and longing were planted in soil already cracked by neglect. Years that prepared him, unknowingly, for the turning point that would soon reshape the course of his entire life. As Edmund moved deeper into adolescence, the emotional distance between him and the world around him widened in ways that even he didn't fully understand. He watched other teenagers form friendships, build confidence, discover their identities, and step into early adulthood with a sense of belonging. He, on the other hand, felt himself drifting farther from those milestones, like a person standing on a shoreline watching everyone else sail into a future he couldn't reach. His mother's voice, still the loudest force in his life, became sharper and more critical as the years went on. She used his size as both a weapon and a shield, accusing him of being intimidating while insisting that no woman would ever want someone like him. She told him he was destined to fail. She told him he wasn't smart enough, charming enough, or normal enough to be liked. These were not passing comments. They were repeated refrains that shaped his sense of self long before he had the chance to understand who he really was. And as those words settled deeper into his mind, Edmund began to believe them. The home environment grew more hostile as financial stress, exhaustion, and emotional instability shaped his mother's behavior. She worked long hours, slept irregularly, and often took out her frustrations on him in ways that left no visible marks but carved deep emotional lines. She would swing between cold detachment and explosive anger, leaving Edmund unsure of which version of her he would face on any given day. This unpredictability pushed him further into isolation. He learned to speak less, move quietly, stay out of sight, and avoid triggering her temper. In many ways, he learned to disappear inside his own home. In this emotional vacuum, Edmund's inner world became his refuge. He spent hours alone, thinking, observing, trying to make sense of a life that felt increasingly unstable. He developed a fascination with how people behaved, why they laughed, why they argued, why they seemed to find comfort in things that brought him none. That curiosity, mixed with loneliness, created a growing disconnect inside him. He could mimic emotions, understand them logically, but struggled to feel them deeply. He became familiar with the mechanics of connection without experiencing the warmth of it. And year by year, that inability to genuinely connect created an emotional hollowness he didn't know how to name. His attempts to bond with others often fell flat. Peers saw him as awkward or intimidating, and teachers interpreted his silence as disinterest. He wanted to belong, but each attempt at connection seemed to reinforce the distance between him and everyone else. Conversations felt like puzzles he couldn't solve. Friendships slipped through his fingers before they formed. Girls avoided him, not because of anything he did, but because they didn't know how to respond to someone who looked like a grown man yet carried the uncertainty of a boy. This mismatch, between appearance and inner world, became one of the central tensions of his life. His mother fueled this tension by insisting that his size made him dangerous. She reminded him constantly that he frightened people, that girls would never trust him, that he was destined to be alone. These statements, repeated so often they became familiar, created a blueprint of failure he internalized long before he had the chance to prove it wrong. By the time Edmund reached his later teenage years, the emotional damage had accumulated into something heavy and persistent. He felt trapped, too old to be treated like a child, too inexperienced to be treated like an adult, too large to go unnoticed, and too insecure to take up the space he physically occupied. That contradiction remained at the center of his identity, a physically imposing young man who felt emotionally invisible. As his internal world grew more complicated, so did his relationship with control. He started to see control not as something earned, but as something taken, something that existed outside the fragile emotional realm where he felt inadequate. Control became a stabilizing force, a mental anchor in a life where everything felt unpredictable and unstable. Control was certainty. Control was order. Control was safety. And although he had not yet taken that idea into dark places, the psychological foundation was forming quietly in the background. His resentment simmered beneath the surface, not expressed outwardly but trapped in long, unspoken thoughts that he carried like weights. He resented his mother's treatment, resented his father's absence, resented the world for misunderstanding him, resented the loneliness that seemed to follow him everywhere. But he didn't know where to direct those feelings. He didn't know how to release them. He didn't know how to ask for help. Instead, he internalized everything, letting each emotional wound form another layer of isolation. By the time he approached adulthood, the emotional distance that separated him from others had hardened into something more permanent. He had learned to survive without affection, without approval, without connection. And in that emotional void, he developed a worldview shaped by distance rather than closeness, observing humanity from the outside rather than participating in it. These early wounds left marks that would follow him long after he left home, long after childhood ended, long after the world would come to know his name. They set the stage for the choices he would make, the life he would lead, and the darkness that would grow quietly within him, not overnight, not suddenly, but through years of silence, neglect, resentment, and unmet emotional needs. What emerged from those early years was not yet the co-ed killer, but the young man who would become him. And as Edmund stepped into early adulthood, the unresolved shadows he carried from childhood would begin to shape the path ahead, one marked by confusion, anger, desperation, and the quiet unraveling of a mind already stretched thin by a lifetime of emotional wounds. Chapter 3: The First Murders, Grandparents in Silence. Edmund Kemper's move to live with his grandparents in North Fork, California, was meant to be a chance at stability, an opportunity to reset a troubled life and escape the escalating conflict with his mother. But instead, it became the turning point that marked the beginning of a path no one could have predicted. At 16, Edmund was already taller than most grown men and carried an emotional burden far heavier than his age would suggest. His mother, overwhelmed and exhausted, sent him away believing distance might fix what she saw as behavioral problems. But what she didn't know was that Edmund was carrying years of unresolved frustration, loneliness, and resentment with him, silent weights that followed him north into the quiet, rural home of his grandparents. The ranch in North Fork was a world completely different from the tense, fractured home he grew up in. The air was still, the days long, the silence constant. But that silence didn't soothe Edmund, it amplified everything he'd tried to suppress. His grandfather, a World War I veteran, was often away tending to chores and errands. His grandmother, stern and strict in her own way, became the figure Edmund interacted with most. Their relationship grew strained almost immediately. She questioned him constantly, monitored him closely, and often scolded him in ways that echoed the tone his mother had used for years. In Edmund's mind, she became a symbol of everything he felt trapped by: authority, criticism, and the sense that he was always being judged for who he was rather than who he wanted to be. The isolation of ranch life left Edmund with long stretches of empty time, and in those stretches, his thoughts grew darker, heavier, and harder to ignore. He felt unwanted, sent away by his mother, misunderstood by relatives, and disconnected from the world around him. Each day felt like another reminder that he didn't belong anywhere. The loneliness that had followed him through childhood was now sharper, more defined, more consuming. And with no friends, no guidance, and no emotional support, Edmund's internal world began spiraling into a place where reality and resentment blended quietly. His grandmother's attempts to discipline him intensified the tension. She saw flashes of anger in him, moments where his size and strength frightened her, and she tried to assert control the only way she knew how, through strictness and sharp words. But those efforts only fueled Edmund's growing sense of suffocation. Every conversation felt like a confrontation. Every rule felt like another chain. He began to feel cornered, emotionally and mentally. And when people feel cornered long enough, they often react in ways even they don't fully understand. As the weeks passed, Edmund's resentment transformed into a quiet storm, silent but building force, moment by moment. He began withdrawing further, speaking less, spending more time alone, and growing increasingly detached from the world around him. His grandmother, sensing his distance, pushed harder, believing structure and discipline might pull him back. But instead, it drove him deeper into the internal darkness he'd been nurturing for years. On a warm August day in 1964, the storm broke. What happened in that small farmhouse wasn't the act of a hardened killer but the eruption of a mind that had been fracturing for years. Edmund later described the moment as a loss of control, a break from himself, like he was watching his actions rather than choosing them. It was a tragic intersection of emotional neglect, psychological instability, and years of unresolved pain. When the immediate silence returned, Edmund felt something he didn't expect: fear, confusion, and a chilling calmness that terrified him more than anything he had done. When his grandfather returned home, Edmund faced a decision no 16-year-old should ever confront. He believed, in a moment of confused logic, that sparing his grandfather from the shock of the scene was an act of mercy. He later said he didn't want his grandfather to walk inside and see what had happened, to feel heartbroken or betrayed. It was a disturbingly tender justification wrapped around an irreversible act. And the moment he made that choice, Edmund realized there was no turning back. What followed wasn't an attempt to run or hide. Instead, Edmund did something that revealed the complexity of his mind: he called the police on himself. He confessed immediately, almost plainly, as though the words weren't his own. There was no attempt to escape responsibility, no fabrication, no dramatic explanation. Just a quiet statement of what he had done, delivered with the calmness that would later become one of the most unsettling traits in his personality. Authorities were shocked by the case. A 16-year-old boy, towering over officers, speaking with politeness and clarity, admitting to something most adults couldn't process. He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't wild or panicked. He was calm. Cooperative. Almost detached. To investigators, it was clear this wasn't a typical crime. It wasn't driven by impulse or substance or accident. It was the outward expression of years of internal damage, damage no one had noticed until it was too late. Psychiatrists were brought in. And the more they spoke to Edmund, the more they realized they were dealing with a mind far more complex than they expected. He was intelligent, articulate, introspective, and able to explain emotions he didn't fully feel. He showed deep awareness of his actions but struggled to understand the emotional mechanisms behind them. To some doctors, he appeared remorseful. To others, he appeared detached. To all, he appeared dangerous, not because of rage, but because of the quiet, calculated calm that surrounded him like a shadow. The courts declared him legally insane, and he was sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a secure psychiatric facility where he would undergo treatment, evaluation, and observation. At 16, he stepped into a world filled with doctors, clinicians, tests, and therapy sessions, becoming one of the youngest inmates ever housed there. And in that environment, his intelligence began to surface in ways no one expected. He memorized psychological terms, learned from clinicians, and became a model patient, so much so that he was eventually allowed to handle sensitive psychological testing materials most inmates would never see. But beneath that impressive surface, something quieter was happening. Edmund wasn't learning how to heal. He was learning how to mimic. How to speak the language of rehabilitation. How to present himself in ways that made doctors believe he was improving. At Atascadero, his mask began to form, a mask he would wear long after his release, long before the world would discover just how dangerous he could become. And as the years passed inside the hospital walls, Edmund Kemper began the transformation from a troubled teenager into a man who understood, far too well, how to hide the darkness growing slowly inside him. Chapter 4, Institutions of Control, Inside Atascadero. Atascadero State Hospital was not the kind of place most 16-year-olds could imagine, let alone experience. It was a world sealed off from the outside, a place where heavy doors echoed through long corridors and where the rhythms of each day were dictated by clinicians, security protocols, and the quiet hum of institutional routine. For Edmund Kemper, stepping through those doors was like entering an entirely new universe, one where time slowed, where identities were stripped down to diagnoses and case numbers, and where every emotion, every thought, every behavior was observed under a clinical lens. Yet, oddly enough, Atascadero was the first place in his life where Edmund felt seen. Not understood, not healed, but seen. The hospital was filled with adults decades older than Edmund, men with violent histories, complex disorders, and long psychiatric records. And yet, within this population, Edmund stood out, not because of his size, though that certainly drew attention, but because of his intelligence. Doctors quickly realized he wasn't an average juvenile offender. He was articulate, introspective, curious, and deeply analytical. He listened closely during therapy sessions, asked questions that revealed a sophisticated grasp of human behavior, and consumed psychological materials with an appetite few inmates could match. To clinicians, this was promising. To Edmund, it was an opportunity. Inside Atascadero, for the first time, Edmund found structure. There were schedules, expectations, and routines he could rely on, something he never had at home. Meals were predictable. Therapy sessions were consistent. Evaluations followed a clear format. And in this highly organized environment, Edmund began learning how to present himself in ways that earned praise rather than criticism. He discovered that calmness, compliance, and insight were rewarded, and he leaned heavily into those traits. He adapted quickly, mimicking the emotional responses clinicians expected from a patient on the path toward rehabilitation. What no one realized at the time was that Edmund's intelligence allowed him to analyze not only his own behavior, but the behavior of the staff evaluating him. He learned the language of psychiatry, the terminology of diagnosis, the phrasing clinicians used when describing emotional growth and progress. He became so skilled at navigating the system that staff members, impressed by his dedication, allowed him to assist with psychological testing, a role rarely offered to young patients. He memorized test structures, learned what traits examiners wanted to see, and studied the scoring systems used to evaluate mental health. Most teenagers in his situation were overwhelmed by the hospital environment. But Edmund was empowered by it. He absorbed information like a sponge, filing away every concept, every technique, every behavioral model. He learned how clinicians identified manipulation, and how to avoid triggering their suspicion. He learned the difference between genuine self-reflection and the performance of self-awareness, and how to blur the line between the two. In essence, Atascadero gave Edmund a psychological toolkit that he would later weaponize in ways no one anticipated. Despite this, there were moments during these years when the truth of Edmund's inner struggle surfaced. In therapy, he spoke about feeling abandoned, misunderstood, and trapped by his own mind. He acknowledged that his childhood had fractured his sense of self and that he often felt disconnected from his emotions. These disclosures were genuine, but incomplete. Edmund revealed just enough to appear vulnerable, but not enough to reveal the full extent of what lay beneath. His therapists saw a bright young man making progress. What they didn't see was how much of that progress was learned behavior, rehearsed over and over until it felt natural. Atascadero was a place designed to treat and contain. But for Edmund, it became a classroom, a place where he studied not only psychology but human nature itself. He learned how people responded to authority, how they interpreted behavior, how they measured sincerity. He observed the emotional patterns of other patients, noting which behaviors alarmed clinicians and which behaviors earned trust. Over time, he crafted an identity that blended cooperation, humility, introspection, and emotional restraint, an identity that fit perfectly within the framework of a model patient. But underneath that carefully constructed persona, the fractures from his past were still present. Therapy addressed his actions, but not the roots of his internal conflict. His loneliness didn't disappear, it simply became quieter, easier to manage under the appearance of improvement. His resentment didn't fade, it sank deeper, settling beneath layers of controlled behavior. His need for connection didn't diminish, it became entangled with feelings of inadequacy and confusion. And because he learned to perform emotional growth so convincingly, no one realized how little of that growth had taken hold where it truly mattered, inside his ability to feel and express authentic emotion. Over several years, Edmund became one of Atascadero's most trusted patients. He was respectful, helpful, and eager to learn. Staff members wrote glowing reports, describing him as intelligent, cooperative, and rehabilitated. They noted his self-awareness, his remorse, his understanding of his actions. And in time, these reports shaped the recommendation that would change everything. Edmund, they believed, was ready for release. He was released at age 21, returned to the care of the very person whose criticism and emotional volatility had shaped much of his internal turmoil, his mother. Doctors believed he was stable, improved, rehabilitated. They believed he had developed the emotional tools he needed to re-enter society. They believed he understood the gravity of his actions and had learned how to manage his impulses. But what they didn't understand was that Edmund had left Atascadero with something far more dangerous than untreated wounds. He left with knowledge. Knowledge of how to present himself. Knowledge of how to hide his intentions. Knowledge of how to mimic emotional normalcy. He had learned the system from the inside out. And while the hospital had controlled his environment, it had not resolved the loneliness, resentment, or psychological confusion that had consumed him since childhood. As he walked out the gates, tall and calm and polite, Edmund Kemper carried with him a mask that would fool everyone around him. A mask of stability. A mask of rehabilitation. A mask he had built with the help of the very institution meant to heal him. And behind that mask, the parts of Edmund that were still fractured, still unresolved, still searching for control, remained silently intact, waiting for the moment when the world outside would test what he had learned inside. Chapter 5: The Mask of Rehabilitation, Kemper's Release. When Edmund Kemper walked out of Atascadero State Hospital at 21 years old, the world looked familiar, but he didn't feel like he belonged to any of it. The air smelled the same, the streets buzzed with the same steady rhythm, the everyday noises of California life wrapped around him, but he moved through it like someone stepping gently into a life that no longer fit. He had spent 5 years inside an institution where every decision was monitored, where every day followed the same tightly controlled structure, where emotions were labeled and categorized rather than experienced. Now he was expected to walk into freedom as though those years had been a pause rather than a transformation. His clinicians believed he was ready. They believed he had grown, learned, stabilized. But Edmund did not feel stable. He felt prepared to present himself, prepared to behave, prepared to mimic the version of himself he knew adults wanted to see. But beneath that careful surface, he carried the same quiet loneliness, the same confusion about connection, and the same deep resentment that had followed him since childhood. As part of his release conditions, Edmund was sent to live with the one person whose presence had shaped so much of his emotional instability, his mother, Clarnell. The state believed she was a stabilizing influence, someone capable of supporting her son's transition back into society. They didn't understand the history between them. They didn't understand the years of emotional volatility, the rejection, the criticism. They didn't understand that returning Edmund to her home meant reigniting the very wounds that had contributed to his breakdown in the first place. When he arrived at her small apartment in Santa Cruz, she greeted him with a cautious politeness, the kind people offer when they don't know what version of someone they'll be meeting. Edmund towered over her, now fully grown, 6 feet 9 inches, soft-spoken and calm, carrying a hospital's worth of practiced composure. She commented on his size. She commented on his presence. She commented on how strange it was to have him back. Each remark felt like a needle. But Edmund accepted it all with a quiet smile, the same quiet smile he had mastered at Atascadero. Their relationship resumed as though no time had passed, tense, inconsistent, layered with old resentments and new uncertainties. She alternated between treating him like a child and treating him like an inconvenience. Some days she demanded respect, other days she dismissed him entirely. Some evenings she talked to him for hours, others she deliberately ignored him. The same patterns that had fractured their relationship when he was a boy returned now with more force. And yet, Edmund tried to stay calm. He tried to stay composed. He tried to be the rehabilitated version of himself he knew the world wanted to see. He found work where he could, often menial short-term jobs that didn't last. Employers were unsettled by his size, confused by his overly formal manner, unsure of how to read someone who seemed gentle and intimidating at the same time. He tried to make friends but felt out of place. He tried to date but felt awkward around women, burdened by the years of criticism that told him no one would ever accept him. Every attempt at normalcy felt like a performance he didn't know how to sustain. Meanwhile, his mother's criticisms continued. She told him he ate too much. She told him he slept too late. She told him he wasn't trying hard enough. She told him he was a burden. She reminded him constantly that he was lucky to have a place to stay. Her words stung the same way they had when he was a child. Each comment reopened an old wound. Each argument chipped away at the fragile stability he had built at Atascadero. And the more she criticized him, the more Edmund withdrew into himself, silently carrying emotions he couldn't express. During this time, he tried to reconnect with his sisters, hoping for some form of normal family bond. But they were unsure how to speak to him, unsure how to understand him, unsure whether to treat him as a sibling or a stranger. The gulf between them had grown wide, shaped by years apart and by the shadow of what he had done. They treated him kindly, but with caution. Edmund felt that caution. He felt it every time someone hesitated in conversation, every time someone paused before responding to him, every time someone looked at him as though trying to decide whether he was safe. In these years after his release, Edmund lived a double reality. Outwardly, he was calm, cooperative, polite, the picture of rehabilitation. He attended therapy sessions, followed probation rules, worked odd jobs, obeyed the expectations placed upon him. Inwardly, he was unraveling. The emotional conflict with his mother reignited old resentment. The isolation reminded him of the years he spent in the basement as a child. The constant criticism cut into him like familiar wounds reopened. And worst of all, he felt the early tremors of the psychological tension that would eventually push him toward darkness. Atascadero had taught him how to act rehabilitated, but it had not healed the unresolved core of who he was. It had not taught him how to build relationships, how to process emotions, how to cope with rejection, how to manage loneliness. It had not given him the tools to navigate the world with authenticity, only the tools to navigate it with performance. And so, bit by bit, Edmund's internal world began to fray. He spent more time driving alone, cruising along California highways in long loops that had no destination. He watched people from a distance, students walking arm in arm across campus, couples talking softly under street lamps, families laughing outside restaurants, and each scene felt like a window into a life permanently closed. To him. He didn't understand why connection came so easily to others and so painfully to him. He didn't understand why he felt invisible even in crowded rooms. He didn't understand why the loneliness that had followed him since childhood now felt heavier than ever. This was the quiet period before the storm, the years when Edmund drifted between wanting to change and feeling incapable of changing, between wanting acceptance and believing he didn't deserve it, between wanting to belong and realizing he never truly had. These contradictions built slowly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the surface. And the more they grew, the more Edmund felt himself slipping out of alignment with the life he was trying so desperately to maintain. People around him saw a large, quiet young man trying to rebuild his life. They saw politeness, helpfulness, intelligence. They saw someone who deserved a second chance. What they didn't see was the internal struggle that never stopped, the battle between the rehabilitated exterior and the fragile, fractured interior. The battle between the mask and the truth. The battle that eventually, inevitably, would break. The mask he built at Atascadero was strong. Polished. Convincing. But masks are not meant to be worn forever, and as Edmund's frustrations grew, the surface began to crack, not suddenly, not explosively, but slowly, like hairline fracture spreading across a mirror. He didn't act out. He didn't lash out. But something inside him shifted, an almost imperceptible tilt toward the path that would define his future. And somewhere in those quiet years, between the arguments with his mother, the lonely drives, the failed attempts at building a normal life, the first seeds of his dark return were planted. The seeds that would grow into the storm Santa Cruz never saw coming. Chapter 6, A Quiet Storm, Life After the Hospital. When Edmund Kemper settled into life in Santa Cruz after his release, the world saw only the surface, a polite young man trying to rebuild, a towering but soft-spoken figure attempting to find stable footing after years inside a psychiatric institution. He walked with a kind of careful calm, as though afraid to disturb the rhythm of everyday life around him. To neighbors, he appeared harmless, odd, perhaps, but respectful. To employers, he was dependable in small ways, showing up on time, doing what he was told, never causing trouble. And to the clinicians who occasionally checked on him, he seemed like a promising example of successful rehabilitation. But inside, Edmund felt none of that stability. He felt like a guest in his own life, tiptoeing through days that seemed borrowed, balancing between who he was expected to be and who he feared he might still be. Living with his mother again was like stepping back into a storm he had spent years trying to escape. The apartment was small, the walls thin, the atmosphere thick with tension that simmered quietly beneath even the most ordinary conversations. Clarnell had not softened with age. She remained sharp-tongued, unpredictable, and emotionally distant. She cycled between periods of guarded affection and stretches of cold withdrawal. Some days she spoke to Edmund as though he were a burden, other days she treated him like a dangerous stranger. For Edmund, every interaction felt like walking across a floor that could crack under him at any moment. He tried, at first, to maintain peace. He kept his voice low, his tone polite. He avoided arguments, avoided confrontation, avoided the old patterns that had defined their relationship when he was younger. But those efforts only carried him so far. His mother had her own frustrations, failed marriages, financial stress, exhaustion from long work hours, and Edmund became the easiest target for her bitterness. Her words were small cuts delivered daily, comments about his laziness, complaints about his presence, reminders that he had nowhere else to go. She called him too big, too awkward, too strange, too dependent. And each remark echoed years of childhood criticism that had shaped him long before his first stay in the basement. He applied for jobs, sometimes finding temporary work doing manual labor, sometimes driving long distances for minimum-wage tasks that barely lasted a few weeks. He tried a short stint at a college, but his discomfort around students, especially young women, made the environment unbearable. Every time he spoke to someone on campus, he felt a wave of self-consciousness. His height drew stares, his awkwardness drew confusion, and the years of his mother telling him that no woman would ever want him still lingered like a bruise beneath his confidence. Each failed attempt at blending in deepened his belief that he wasn't meant to be part of normal life. When jobs didn't last, Edmund turned increasingly to driving, hours spent alone in his car, rolling through long stretches of California highways, the hum of the engine becoming a kind of sanctuary where he didn't feel judged or watched. He drove through farmland, along cliffs, past busy campuses, through quiet suburbs. The movement soothed him. The scenery blurred into something calm and predictable. He found peace in the steady rhythm of the road, a peace he rarely felt at home. During these solitary drives, Edmund watched people the way an outsider watches a world they don't belong to. He saw students carrying backpacks, laughing in groups, couples holding hands as they crossed the street, families loading groceries into their cars, young women with bright expressions hitchhiking along the roadside. These glimpses of normal life made something ache inside him, something shaped by loneliness, longing, and years of believing he didn't deserve the warmth others seemed to share so easily. His mother's nightly criticisms only deepened this ache. She often came home from work tired, irritated, and ready to unleash whatever emotions she had held in during the day. She would question Edmund's decisions, mock his ambitions, and remind him repeatedly that he would never succeed, never be loved, never be trusted. Her tone was sharp, dismissive, belittling. And although Edmund rarely spoke back, each insult left a mark. He would retreat to his room afterward, listening to the TV playing in the living room, feeling the same sense of exclusion he had felt as a child locked in the basement. But something was different now. He was no longer the quiet boy shrinking under the weight of her words. He was a grown man, massive, intelligent, emotionally complex, and the tension inside him did not dissolve the way it once had. It simmered. It pressed against the edges of his composure. It created a quiet friction between who he wanted to be and who he feared he was becoming. During this period, observers might have mistaken Edmund's politeness for stability. They would see him open doors for strangers, help carry groceries for elderly neighbors, assist co-workers without complaint. He had a gentle voice, a calm smile, and a demeanor that made people momentarily forget how imposing his size was. But his politeness was not rooted in confidence, it was rooted in survival. It was a mask that kept the world at ease, a shield that prevented anyone from seeing the emotional turbulence beneath. He began spending time at local bars, not to socialize but to sit quietly among people, feeling their presence like a distant warmth he couldn't quite reach. He listened to conversations, laughed politely when someone made a joke, nodded when someone greeted him. But these interactions were surface level, flickering moments of connection that faded as soon as he stepped outside into the night air. He longed for deeper relationships yet felt unable to create them. He wanted to belong but had no idea how to bridge the emotional distance between himself and the rest of the world. The emotional pressure of living with his mother grew heavier with each passing month. Their arguments became louder, more frequent. Sometimes she accused him of being lazy, sometimes she mocked his size, sometimes she told him he reminded her of his father, an insult she knew cut deeply. And Edmund absorbed it all quietly at first, letting her words settle into the weary spaces of his mind. But the calmness he displayed outwardly hid a growing fracture inside him, a slow-building storm fueled by resentment, humiliation, and a lifetime of feeling unwanted. During this time, Edmund also began to feel moments of dissociation, fleeting intervals where he felt detached from his surroundings, as though watching his life unfold from a distance. These episodes were subtle at first, barely noticeable. But as the emotional pressure at home increased and his loneliness deepened, the dissociation grew stronger. It became easier to imagine different outcomes to his frustrations, easier to picture himself acting out in ways he had never allowed himself to before. He filled his time with distractions, reading, driving, lifting weights, repairing his car, observing people from afar. But none of these activities resolved the emotional void at his core. If anything, they highlighted it. The more he watched others live normal lives, the more painfully aware he became of his own inability to do the same. He tried to find hobbies that grounded him, but each attempt ended the same way, with Edmund drifting back into his car, back into the long highways where he could disappear for hours without anyone questioning where he was. The storm inside him grew slowly, quietly, like water rising behind a dam. No outbursts. No obvious warning signs. Just a steady accumulation of old wounds, new frustrations, and unresolved conflicts that pressed against each other until the pressure became unbearable. His mother noticed the changes in him but misinterpreted them as laziness or stubbornness. She didn't see the emotional unraveling beneath his silence. She didn't see the loneliness that had shaped him since childhood. She didn't see the quiet desperation behind his attempts to find stability. Instead, she saw only what irritated her, his presence, his size, his failures. Their arguments escalated. Their conversations grew sharper. And every night, Edmund retreated into a silence that held more weight than anyone realized. This period, these calm yet restless years after Atascadero, became the foundation for everything that followed. They were the years when Edmund tried to control the storm inside him and failed. The years when loneliness became unbearable. The years when resentment became fuel. The years when the mask of rehabilitation began to crack under the weight of emotional strain. And as the cracks deepened, Edmund found himself drifting toward a dark return, one shaped by everything he had never truly healed, everything he had never learned to express, and everything he had spent a lifetime holding inside. The quiet storm was approaching its break. And when it finally broke, it would change Santa Cruz forever. Chapter 7, The Dark Return, First Co-ed Victims. The year was 1972, and Santa Cruz was a picture of California calm, warm afternoons drifting into cool evenings, students lining the roads with backpacks and laughter, hitchhikers thumbing their way along Highway 1 beneath skies painted gold at sunset. To most people, the city felt safe, peaceful, tucked away from the chaos of the world. But for Edmund Kemper, the peace outside only deepened the storm within. He had tried, desperately, to keep his life stable. He took long drives, stayed quiet, focused on work when he could, and tried to avoid conflict with his mother. But the tension in that small apartment had grown unbearable. Her criticisms, her cutting remarks, her reminders that he was a failure, each one chipped away at what little stability he had left. The arguments had escalated. The silence afterward grew heavier. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Edmund began drifting toward a kind of emotional breaking point that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He spent more hours alone in his car than he did in the apartment. The freedom of the open road became a relief from the suffocating confinement of home. The engine's hum soothed him. The sound of tires rolling across asphalt calmed him in ways that conversations never could. He memorized the curves of California's coastal highways, the dips and turns of the mountain roads, the long stretches of landscape where no one asked him to speak, explain, or defend himself. And on these drives, he watched the world, especially the young women who lined the roads with their backpacks, unaware of the shadows moving beneath Edmund's calm expression. Hitchhiking was common then, almost a ritual of the era. Students trusted strangers. Strangers trusted students. Cars stopped without hesitation, and people climbed in without fear. Edmund noticed how easily it happened. How a smile, a quiet tone, or a polite gesture could open the doors to a stranger's life. He studied the interactions the way a scientist might study human behavior. He watched the body language, the easy conversations, the relaxed laughter between drivers and hitchhikers. And with every passing day, he felt two conflicting emotions rising inside him, fascination and resentment. Fascination toward the freedom these women seemed to embody, young, confident, navigating life with ease. Resentment because he felt permanently locked out of that world. During this time, the pressure at home intensified. His mother had taken a job at the University of California, Santa Cruz, surrounded by students the same age as the hitchhikers Edmund watched from his car. Every night she came home complaining about them, their noise, their attitudes, their arrogance. She accused Edmund of being like them, lazy, ungrateful, entitled. The comparisons gnawed at him. She would say things like, "You'll never have what they have. You don't deserve it." Comments she had repeated throughout his childhood now returned with new venom. Edmund said nothing, but the silence inside him expanded like a widening crack. He began picking up hitchhikers, not with dark intent at first, but to practice calmness, to master the composure he needed to ensure no one saw the storm building beneath the surface. He drove them safely to their destinations, speaking little, listening much. He studied their reactions, their comfort levels, their conversations. He examined how trust formed between strangers. These early drives were rehearsals, silent tests of his self-control, lessons in human psychology performed in real time. And each safe ride convinced him of something dangerous, that he was capable of maintaining perfect composure, even while carrying the weight of darker possibilities inside him. But the longer these encounters continued, the more the line between intention and impulse began to blur. The resentment from home mixed with his loneliness, his feelings of inadequacy, his longing for connection, and his growing emotional instability. On some nights, he would grip the steering wheel tightly after dropping someone off, feeling a rush of conflicting emotions, anger, longing, frustration, and a sense of helplessness that made his chest tight. The storm inside him was no longer quiet. It was gathering speed. The turning point came slowly, not in a single moment, but in a gradual erosion of his restraint. Edmund felt something shifting inside him, something he couldn't push down anymore. The rehearsals became rituals. The rituals became temptations. And eventually, the temptations became intentions, creeping into his thoughts with alarming clarity. He began making small preparations, items placed in the car, routes mapped out in his mind, scenarios imagined with increasing realism. He became more selective with whom he picked up. He watched the roads differently now, not as a driver passing time, but as someone scouting opportunities. The night of the first escalation was quiet, fog hanging low over the coastal hills as Edmund drove aimlessly, trying to escape another argument with his mother. His mind replayed the exchange, her voice sharp, her words laced with contempt, and he felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Hours passed before he saw two young women standing near the road, backpacks slung over their shoulders, shivering in the cool air. Their faces were open and trusting, the way so many hitchhikers were in that era. Edmund's hands tightened on the wheel. 100 memories collided in his mind, his mother's insults, his own loneliness, his sense of being invisible and unwanted, the quiet anger he had carried for years. And with a calmness that frightened even him, he pulled over. He spoke politely, as he always did. His deep voice was steady. His expression was soft. The women relaxed almost immediately, stepping into the car with the same trust he had seen so many times before. As they settled in, Edmund felt a strange clarity settle over him. The storm inside him wasn't raging. It was quiet, eerily quiet. A dangerous kind of calm. And in that calm, he crossed the line he had spent months approaching, the line between the man he pretended to be and the man he feared he truly was. California coast had not yet cracked. People trusted one another, strangers made easy conversation, and danger felt like something that happened in far-off cities, not in the peaceful quiet of a college town. But beneath that surface, a pattern was beginning to form, slowly, subtly, almost invisibly at first. A pattern that would soon reshape the mood of the entire region. And at the center of it, moving quietly through the roads and forests, was Edmund Kemper, calm, unnoticed, and growing more confident with each drive he took. After the first incident, Edmund felt a strange combination of numbness and relief, like a pressure valve inside him had finally opened. His internal storm had broken, yet outwardly he remained composed, polite, almost serene. He went about his daily routines, fixing his car in the driveway, helping neighbors carry groceries, making small talk at bars in the evenings, and enduring the sharp, dismissive tone of his mother when he returned home each night. Nothing about him changed in a way the world could see. But something inside him had shifted permanently. It wasn't frenzy. It wasn't loss of control. It was the opposite, calm, clarity, and a chilling sense of capability. During this period, Edmund became even more thoughtful in the way he navigated the world. He planned more, observed more, measured every detail. His drives grew longer, extending beyond the familiar loops around Santa Cruz County and into the stretches of coastal highway linking the city to San Francisco. He watched the flow of hitchhikers with new scrutiny, noticing patterns he had overlooked before, where they gathered, which days were busiest, which hours students traveled most, which roads offered isolation, and which routes provided quick escapes. Edmund did not move impulsively. He moved like someone taking careful notes, refining a method he had not yet fully admitted to himself. Meanwhile, at home, the tension with his mother escalated. Each night when she returned from her job at the university, her complaints filled the small apartment. She criticized Edmund's weight, his job prospects, his lack of social life, telling him he was a disappointment, that he would never amount to anything, that no woman would ever want someone like him. The old wounds reopened daily, the same wounds that had shaped his childhood. Whenever they argued, Edmund felt a familiar burning inside him, not rage, but a deep emotional ache that felt like humiliation and longing colliding at once. He would retreat to his room afterward, lying awake in the dim light, listening to her footsteps in the kitchen, replaying every cutting remark in his mind. He could feel the storm inside him rebuilding, slowly and painfully. His drives, those long, silent hours on the open road, became the only way he knew to quiet the turmoil. And as he drove, he began to see the hitchhikers not only as passengers but as symbols of everything he felt denied: freedom, confidence, youth, acceptance. Their easy laughter reminded him of the relationships he never had. Their casual trust contrasted sharply with the distrust he had known from childhood. Their bright futures amplified the dimness of his own. And as his resentment and fascination worsened, his sense of disconnection from the world grew more pronounced. The pattern of disappearances began quietly. A girl missed a class. Another didn't return home for dinner. Messages were left on dorm boards: "Has anyone seen her?" At first, These incidents were chalked up to the free-spirited nature of young adults in the 70s. Students often left for spontaneous trips, visited friends in other cities, stayed out late without calling home. Police assumed these missing persons would turn up within days. Often, they didn't. And the strange truth was that the disappearances were spaced just widely enough to avoid immediate connection, like drops of water falling slowly into a bucket before anyone noticed it was filling. For Edmund, however, the intervals felt natural. Each time he picked someone up, he rehearsed calmness, just as he had before. He maintained polite conversation. He kept his voice steady and his demeanor non-threatening. He had learned how to appear harmless, how to project the image of a gentle giant who would never hurt anyone. And because he had practiced building this image his entire life, he was convincing. The mask of politeness, so deeply ingrained in him through years of coping with his mother's volatility, became the most dangerous tool he possessed. He chose isolated stretches of road, places where his enormous size gave him control, where his intelligence helped him foresee risks, where he could act without interruption. Each incident left him calmer afterward. He didn't spiral into panic. He didn't lose control. Instead, he returned home with the same quiet demeanor he carried every day. His mother didn't notice anything unusual. She rarely did. Her attention was reserved for criticizing him, not observing him. As weeks turned into months, rumors began spreading through the Santa Cruz student community, whispers of young women who never reached their destinations, questions about whether hitchhiking was still safe, warnings shared in soft tones near coffee shops and campus bulletin boards. Some students started traveling in pairs. Some stopped hitchhiking altogether. Others ignored the unease and continued their routines, convinced that whatever was happening wouldn't happen to them. The police were aware of the missing persons, but without evidence linking the cases, they viewed each disappearance independently. Santa Cruz at the time was dealing with an unusual surge of unrelated crime, something locals would later dub the murder capital of the world. Multiple killers were operating simultaneously in the region, each with entirely different methods, motives, and psychological profiles. This created confusion that allowed Edmund to move almost invisibly through the chaos. Each time he acted, Edmund refined his approach. He learned what worked, what didn't, how to maintain control, how to ensure he left no trace. He learned the areas where he felt most confident and the moments where he needed to be cautious. He became methodical, not frantic. And that methodical calmness made him more dangerous than anyone realized. Despite the rising tension in the community, Edmund maintained his double life with eerie precision. To acquaintances, he remained the polite, helpful giant who held doors open and offered friendly greetings. To bar regulars, he was the quiet guy who listened more than he spoke. To his mother, he was still the source of her frustrations, the subject of her nightly criticisms. The duality defined him, half gentle giant, half storm, and the longer he lived in that contradiction, the more he felt himself slipping entirely into the shadowed half. One night, after another blistering argument with his mother, her voice sharp, her tone accusing, her words cutting deeper than she realized, Edmund left the apartment without a destination. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. His chest felt tight, not with anger, but with a sense of inevitability. He drove for hours, the road illuminated by thin streaks of moonlight cutting through the fog. And somewhere along Highway 1, as the ocean wind pushed against his car, he saw another hitchhiker, alone, unaware, trusting. The pattern had become a cycle now. A cycle that fed on emotional pain, loneliness, resentment, and the illusion of control. A cycle that grew easier each time. A cycle that Santa Cruz had not yet recognized. A cycle that would escalate far beyond anything anyone imagined. By late 1972, the pattern of disappearances was no longer ignorable, even if the connections weren't yet clear. Students grew uneasy. Parents called campus officials. Police began comparing cases, looking for links that remained frustratingly vague. Meanwhile, Edmund continued living his double life, calm on the outside, turbulent on the inside, increasingly confident that he could outthink anyone who might suspect him. The pattern had formed. The fear had begun. And Edmund Kemper, the quiet young man who spent his days invisible in plain sight, was growing more comfortable in the darkness he had created. Santa Cruz had not yet understood that the co-ed killer was among them, driving their roads, haunting their hills, hiding behind a polite smile that revealed nothing of the storm beneath. The disappearances were only the beginning. And the pattern was about to sharpen into something far more terrifying. Chapter 9, A Double Life, The Gentle Giant Among Friends. As the disappearances continued to ripple quietly through Santa Cruz, Edmund Kemper moved through daily life with a calmness that made him nearly invisible. To those who knew him, bartenders, co-workers, casual acquaintances, he was simply Big Ed, the polite, soft-spoken giant who never raised his voice, never caused trouble, never seemed threatening in the slightest. It was one of the many contradictions that made him so difficult to detect. A man capable of such darkness by night could appear genuinely gentle by day. His enormous frame made people step back at first, but within minutes of speaking to him, most felt their guard drop. He had a way of speaking that was disarming, slow, clear, thoughtful, sometimes even self-deprecating. He came across as someone who didn't quite fit in but tried earnestly to connect. If anything, people pitied him more than they feared him. This social invisibility wasn't accidental, it was a mask Edmund had crafted over a lifetime, perfected through years of coping with his mother's unpredictable moods. He had learned to be quiet, to be agreeable, to keep his emotions hidden behind a wall of politeness. And now that mask served him chillingly well. He began spending more time at a local bar, the jury room, a place frequented by off-duty police officers. The irony of this wasn't lost on him. He would sit near the end of the bar, sipping beer slowly, listening as officers chatted about their work, the cases they were struggling to solve, the missing students whose disappearances were beginning to concern the department more than they publicly admitted. Edmund didn't insert himself into their conversations, but he listened with a kind of quiet fascination. He blended in as the harmless regular, the tall guy who offered cigarettes, laughed politely at jokes, and asked officers how their day had been. Some of them liked him. Some trusted him. Some even talked to him casually about the very investigation he was fueling, unaware that the man nodding thoughtfully across from them knew far more than he should. Part of Edmund's ability to maintain this double life came from his intelligence. Though he often downplayed his abilities, he had a keen observational mind, skilled at analyzing people's habits, emotional patterns, and vulnerabilities. He knew when to lean in, when to stay silent, when to offer a friendly comment, and when to quietly fade into the background. In social settings, he played the role of the approachable oddball, the giant who seemed gentle enough that no one imagined him capable of harm. In those moments, the mask fit so well even Edmund sometimes believed it. For a man who carried loneliness like a second skin, these small social successes felt comforting, almost normalizing. They gave him glimpses of a life he wished he could have had, one where he fit in, where people didn't look at him with suspicion or discomfort, where he could laugh without the weight of secrecy pressing down on him. He also formed a small circle of acquaintances. These weren't close friendships in the traditional sense. Edmund didn't let anyone too close, nor did he share much about his inner life, but they were people who recognized him, greeted him with warmth, and made him feel momentarily connected. He would help them with car troubles, lift heavy objects for them with ease, or listen to their stories without judgment. They appreciated his willingness to help. They admired his strength. They teased him about his height, and he laughed along, playing the role of the friendly gentle giant who posed no threat to anyone. In the moments he spent with them, Edmund felt a small flicker of belonging, a feeling he had chased his entire life without ever truly catching. But underneath the surface of those interactions, his internal conflict grew stronger. The part of him that longed for connection battled against the darker impulses he had already acted upon. He lived in two worlds that never touched, the world of polite conversation and the world of silent violence. The divide created a tension he carried constantly in his chest, a tightness that ebbed and flowed depending on the day. When he was around people, he could almost pretend he was just another young man searching for his place in the world. But when he was alone, especially in the presence of his mother, that fragile illusion shattered. His mother remained the greatest source of turmoil in his life. Their arguments became more intense as time went on. She criticized his job, his appearance, his social life, and his failure to live up to the expectations she had for him. She compared him unfavorably to his sisters, to his father, to anyone she believed embodied success. She reminded him, sometimes drunk, sometimes stone-cold sober, that he was unwanted as a child and unremarkable as an adult. Her words were sharp, heavy, and delivered with a cruelty that felt almost casual. Edmund's patience grew thinner, and the emotional pressure inside him grew harder to ignore. He could hold himself together around strangers, but not around her. The mask slipped in that apartment, revealing the vulnerability and resentment he tried so hard to conceal. It was during these tense periods that Edmund's nighttime behavior escalated. He found himself driving more frequently, searching for quiet places to think, to breathe, to escape the suffocating emotional environment of home. But these drives, once an escape, became feeding grounds for the darker impulses he had kept at bay for years. His loneliness sharpened. His resentment deepened. His sense of disconnect from the world grew heavier. And when he encountered hitchhikers during these drives, the line between fantasy and action blurred once again. Yet, even as his crimes increased, he maintained the appearance of normalcy with disturbing ease. He laughed at jokes in the bar, held doors for strangers, and chatted politely with neighbors. He gained a reputation for being helpful and kind, someone who would give you a ride, lend you a tool, or listen without judgment. His intelligence and emotional insight helped him mimic the behaviors of someone stable, even though he was anything but. He understood how to present himself, how to mask the turbulence within him, how to navigate conversations in ways that made people trust him. Some acquaintances even described him as sweet. Others said he was shy, harmless, a little awkward, but a good guy. The contradictions between these perceptions and his nighttime actions only widened the psychological divide he lived in. There were nights he returned home shaken by what he had done, not out of guilt, but out of an unsettling calmness that frightened even him. The ease with which he had slipped back into normalcy afterward unsettled him deeply. He wondered whether there was any part of him left that could be saved, or whether the man he pretended to be during the day was already disappearing entirely. During this period, the police investigation gained momentum. Officers began comparing missing persons cases across campuses, looking for patterns, connecting dates and locations, mapping disappearances. But because Edmund chose his victims randomly and left so few clues, the detectives remained stumped. They theorized multiple killers, drifters, cult activity, anything but the polite young man sitting quietly at the end of their bar. And Edmund listened to their theories with a steady expression, offering a nod here and there, occasionally asking a vague question, never revealing how much he actually knew. This created an almost surreal double life for him, one where he was both the subject of conversation and an active participant in it. He felt a strange sense of control listening to officers speculate about his crimes. Not arrogance, but a chilling calmness, as though he were observing a puzzle he had no intention of solving for them. He felt untouchable, invisible, protected by the very image he had worked his entire life to construct. Meanwhile, the fear in the community continued to grow. Rumors spread across campuses like fog creeping between redwood trees. Students warned one another to stop hitchhiking. Professors advised young women to avoid traveling alone. Parents called their children more frequently, urging them to stay safe. And still, the disappearances continued, sporadic, unpredictable, unconnected by the public, but deeply understood by Edmund, who watched the rising fear with a detached, analytical gaze. His double life reached its peak during this period. By day, he played the friendly giant who helped everyone and hurt no one. By night, he stepped into the shadows of the roads and forests, navigating a world shaped only by his loneliness, his resentment, and the emotional scars he had carried since childhood. The contradiction became so vast that even Edmund began to feel trapped between the two identities, unsure which one was the real him. Or whether both were fragments of a self he could no longer control. This internal fracture deepened with each passing month, each argument with his mother, each night spent listening to police officers speculate in front of him. He felt like he existed in a limbo, half welcomed by the world, half alienated from it. His emotional turmoil pushed him further into isolation, and isolation fed the darkness that had begun to define him. The mask still held, convincing almost everyone who encountered him. But beneath that mask, the cracks widened, revealing a widening gap between the man he pretended to be and the man he feared he truly was. And as that gap grew, Edmund's double life edged toward a breaking point. One that would shatter the illusion he had maintained so carefully. One that would propel him deeper into the shadows of Santa Cruz. And one that would bring the city closer to realizing that the gentle giant they trusted was the very person they were trying so desperately to find. Chapter 10, Conversations with Death, The Murders Escalate. The year was moving steadily toward its midpoint, and Santa Cruz still carried the illusion of calm that had always defined it, students lounging on campus lawns, cars humming along the roads that curved through redwood forests, the Pacific breeze drifting across neighborhoods in soft, cool waves. But beneath that peaceful atmosphere, Edmund Kemper's internal storm had begun accelerating in ways even he couldn't fully understand. The silence of his daily life, the tension with his mother, and the unbearable loneliness that accompanied him everywhere were building pressure inside him like a slow-rising tide. The mask he wore during the day, polite, soft-spoken, helpful, remained perfectly in place, but behind it, the turbulence was reaching a point of no return. Each time he picked up a hitchhiker and returned home afterward, he felt the barrier between restraint and action thinning. Each night, he found himself replaying moments in his mind, thinking about what he had done, what he could do, and how strangely calm he felt in those moments of absolute control. His loneliness wasn't just emotional anymore, it had become physical, a heaviness that wrapped around his chest and filled his mind with dark possibilities he no longer tried to suppress. As the weeks passed, his drives grew longer and more deliberate. He knew the back roads better than most locals, every bend of Empire Grade, every quiet turnout along Highway 1, every narrow forested route where a car could pull over without being seen. His knowledge wasn't casual. It was calculated. He drove these roads at night with the windows down, letting the cool air hit his face as if it could soothe the restless ache inside him. The shadows between the trees felt comforting. The isolation fed something deep and quiet within him. And the sight of hitchhikers, young, trusting, unaware, pulled at the darkest part of his mind with an intensity he no longer resisted. His second attack happened with far less internal conflict than the first. There was no long pause of deliberation, no hesitation, no need to convince himself. It came almost naturally, as though the first incident had broken some internal barrier that, once shattered, could never be rebuilt. When the opportunity appeared, a young woman traveling alone, her backpack slung over one shoulder, Edmund felt the same eerie calmness settle over him. He pulled over with the same polite greeting he always used, and she climbed into the car without fear. As he drove, the conversation flowed easily. He asked her questions about her classes, her plans, her family. She answered with the open, trusting tone that so many hitchhikers had in that era. And all the while, Edmund's voice remained gentle, steady, almost soothing. But beneath that calmness, his mind was racing, not with panic or confusion, but with the same cold clarity that had guided him before. When it was over, Edmund didn't tremble. He didn't feel shock. What he felt was a chilling, unsettling steadiness. He had expected some emotional unraveling, some overwhelming guilt or fear, but instead he felt a strange emptiness, an emptiness that scared him more than any violent impulse ever could. He cleaned the car with precision, returning home hours later, walking into the apartment with the same quiet heaviness he carried every night. His mother didn't notice anything. She rarely noticed him at all. She was asleep, the television flickering in the dark, her snores drifting through the thin walls of the small apartment. Edmund waited until the house was silent before sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his hands, trying to understand himself. But there were no answers, only silence, and a numbness that seemed to pool somewhere deep behind his calm expression. The next morning, he woke early, the sun streaming through his window, and felt a strange sense of normalcy. He ate breakfast quietly, listening to his mother complain about her coworkers and the students at the university. He nodded politely. He responded softly. He carried out the trash, fixed the loose hinge on the kitchen drawer, and drove her to work before beginning another long drive of his own. To anyone observing him, he looked like a man trying to make his life work, helpful, polite, steady. No one suspected that the night before, he had slipped further into the shadows of his own mind. Over the following weeks, Edmund's internal duality deepened. His outward persona grew even more polished. He became a familiar presence at the jury room, Big Ed, the gentle giant who sipped beer quietly and listened to officers talk about the rising concerns over missing women. Their conversations fascinated him, not because he felt pride or superiority, but because of the surreal nature of it. He would sit at the bar, nodding thoughtfully as detectives discussed leads, theories, and possibilities. They spoke about the case like it was a distant storm, an unpredictable threat lurking somewhere out there. And Edmund, towering beside them, listened without revealing the truth that he was the storm they were chasing. But as calm as he appeared, the darkness inside him kept growing, fed by loneliness, resentment, and the emotional wounds he carried from his childhood. Every argument with his mother made the pressure inside him tighten. Every look of disappointment from her reopened the scars he had never healed. He wanted connection, but he didn't know how to find it. He wanted peace, but he didn't know how to create it. He felt trapped between the person he wanted to be and the person he feared he had already become. His next crimes came more frequently. There were nights when he would return home just before dawn, exhausted but eerily calm, slipping into bed as if returning from an ordinary outing. The precision of his actions disturbed even him. He began to realize he was operating in two emotional states at once, one coldly analytical, the other deeply wounded. In the mornings, he performed chores around the apartment, drove his mother to work, fixed things around the house. In the evenings, he acted as the quiet, respectful bar regular who asked officers about their families and nodded when they discussed safety concerns for the students at UCSC. By night, he drove back into the darkness that had become his private world. The pressure inside him reached new levels of intensity as his mother's criticisms grew sharper. She complained about the noise he made. She complained about the way he ate. She complained about him being too quiet, too passive, too big, too present. She said he was a burden, a mistake, a disappointment. And each word sank deeper into his mind, fueling the storm he had been carrying for decades. The more she tore him down, the more he sought solace in the anonymity of the night. His drives weren't escapes anymore, they were compulsions, fueled by emotions he couldn't articulate or control. The police investigation intensified as more students vanished. Flyers appeared on campus notice boards. Professors warned students to stop hitchhiking. Parents begged their daughters to stay in groups. But hitchhiking was woven into the culture of the time, convenient, normalized, almost expected. And Edmund knew how to appear trustworthy, how to make people feel safe, how to mask the storm in his eyes with a gentle, polite smile. At the height of this escalation, Edmund began talking to himself during his drives, not in a dissociative frenzy, but in quiet, conversational tones as though trying to reason with the darkness inside him. Sometimes he scolded himself, urging restraint. Sometimes he reassured himself, convincing himself he was still in control. Sometimes he spoke aloud to the empty passenger seat, his voice steady and emotionless. These self-directed conversations were his way of holding on to the fragments of sanity he still believed he possessed. But the more he spoke to himself, the clearer it became that the two sides of him, the gentle giant and the silent predator, were drifting further apart. He tried, at times, to stop himself. He avoided certain roads. He took different routes home. He kept his car parked for days. But each attempt at restraint was temporary. The emotional pressure always returned, heavy, suffocating, impossible to ignore. And each time it returned, his response became more predictable. The pattern was no longer an accident of opportunity, it had become a cycle driven by emotional necessity. Through it all, Edmund's outward life never reflected the depth of the darkness he carried. He laughed at jokes with bar regulars, held friendly conversations with police officers, helped neighbors fix their cars, and continued performing small acts of kindness that deepened the illusion of who he appeared to be. Some people even described him as sweet, thoughtful, gentle. In their eyes, he was a man trying to find his place in the world, trying to compensate for his awkwardness and size by being as polite as possible. But inside, the escalation had reached a point where the mask could no longer contain the pressure beneath it. Edmund felt himself slipping, slowly but unmistakably, into a darker version of himself, one defined by loneliness, resentment, emotional wounds, and a growing sense of detachment from the world around him. By late 1973, the storm he carried inside had reached its full strength. And the quiet conversations he had with himself during his night drives were no longer attempts to understand the darkness within him, they were acknowledgments of it. Santa Cruz still didn't know the truth. The police still chased shadows. Students still warned each other cautiously. And Edmund Kemper, living a life split between daylight politeness and nighttime violence, continued moving through the world unseen. The murders were escalating. And the world had no idea how close the storm was to breaking. Chapter 11, Secrets in the Night, covering the crimes. As the disappearances continued to unsettle Santa Cruz, casting quiet ripples of fear across campuses and neighborhoods, Edmund Kemper slipped deeper into the shadows of his double existence, moving with a calculated quietness that concealed the escalating storm within him. The calm exterior he showed the world, polite nods, soft-spoken greetings, long, contemplative drives, never revealed the meticulous, methodical care he took to conceal every trace of his nighttime actions. To Edmund, covering the evidence wasn't just about escaping suspicion, it was about controlling the narrative of his life in a world that had always made him feel powerless. In his mind, his ability to erase his presence from the scenes of his crimes became a twisted form of mastery, an affirmation that for once, he wasn't the boy hidden in a basement or the adult mocked by his mother, he was someone capable, someone careful, someone in complete control of his own world. That illusion of control fueled him as much as the acts themselves, forming the core of a pattern that was becoming more calculated, more rehearsed, and more deliberate as time passed. He had always been observant, but now he sharpened that skill with chilling precision. Each time he picked up a hitchhiker, he didn't just study his passenger, he studied the environment, the condition of the road, the strength of the moonlight, the density of traffic, the likely presence of witnesses, the potential angles from which someone might see his car. He observed the vegetation along the roadsides, the depth of the ditches, the accessibility of remote areas where he could pull over without attracting attention. He timed how long it took for other cars to appear, how the headlights illuminated the curves, how secluded certain turnouts became once night settled fully over the coast. Every detail mattered. Every detail was filed away in his mind like notes in a meticulously organized mental ledger. When he acted, he did so with a calculated efficiency that left little room for mistakes. And when the acts were done, he used the same precision to cover his tracks, cleaning thoroughly, planning routes that disguised his movements, and maintaining a perfectly ordinary demeanor that disarmed suspicion before it could form. His home life, despite being a constant source of emotional turmoil, became another part of his cover. The arguments with his mother, her constant belittling, the sharpness of her insults, all these elements contributed to a narrative that outsiders might interpret as stress or depression or frustration with life. Nothing in their interactions pointed toward the truth, not only because Edmund hid it well, but because the world rarely looked closely at someone who seemed quiet and unremarkable. His mother's constant harassment of him, the way she dismissed him, insulted him, and treated him like a burden, ironically kept suspicion away. No one imagined he had the confidence or composure to be involved in something as serious as the disappearances that were slowly mounting around the region. And in his mother's presence, Edmund often felt small again, humiliated, pushed into the emotional suffocation that characterized his childhood. That feeling of being powerless in the apartment made him crave control in the outside world, pushing him deeper into the cycle of nighttime predation and careful concealment. At the jury room bar, Edmund listened closely as police officers discussed the cases. They talked about missing girls, potential suspects, false leads, and the fear beginning to spread among students. They speculated, debated, and expressed frustration about the lack of evidence tying these disappearances together. Meanwhile, Edmund sat there calmly, sometimes nodding, sometimes offering a harmless comment, always appearing engaged but never overly curious. The officers liked him. They saw him as friendly, respectful, and harmless. The kind of man who would never cause trouble. They had no idea that the polite giant listening to them was absorbing every detail, evaluating whether their theories posed any risk to him. When they spoke about locations where bodies might be found or patterns they suspected, Edmund analyzed their words carefully, making mental notes about what to avoid and how to refine his methods. It wasn't a game to him, it was survival. He knew that if he slipped, even once, the entire mask he had built would shatter. The police unknowingly taught him how to remain invisible. Back at home, he kept his room meticulously organized. His car received constant attention, vacuumed, scrubbed, wiped down with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. He learned how to manage the smallest chemicals, how to eliminate odors, how to conceal scratches or marks that might raise questions. He studied his car's interior like a mechanic preparing a showpiece, even though he wasn't doing it for admiration. He was doing it for invisibility. These cleaning rituals became almost meditative for him, moments where he felt fully in control, methodically erasing any trace of actions he refused to acknowledge fully to himself, even as he planned the next ones. Edmund also practiced rehearsed responses in case police ever questioned him. He ran through scenarios in his mind, what he would say if pulled over, how he would explain stains or scratches, how he would mask his anxiety with that same steady calm he used in social settings. He imagined interactions with officers in vivid detail, training himself to maintain composure under pressure. He wasn't confident in many areas of life, but in this domain, this hidden, dark world, he believed he could outthink anyone who confronted him. That belief grew each time he encountered officers casually at the bar. Their lack of suspicion reinforced his sense of superiority, even as the emotional chaos inside him continued to deepen. At the same time, the fear in Santa Cruz began to escalate. Students started traveling in pairs. Professors warned young women to avoid hitchhiking. Flyers appeared everywhere. People whispered about the Santa Cruz killer, though they didn't yet know there were multiple killers operating simultaneously in the same region. The confusion among law enforcement agencies created gaps Edmund skillfully slipped through. His crimes didn't follow the same patterns as the others. His victims didn't fit the same consistent demographic. His methods were different. And because his outward demeanor was so disarming, he didn't appear on anyone's list of potential suspects. The police anxiously searched for clues, but the clues were buried deep in places they never thought to look, or in some cases, buried by Edmund himself, hidden with a precision that made discovery extremely difficult. In these months, Edmund's internal world became more fragmented. He began talking to himself more frequently, holding long monologues during his late-night drives, reasoning with himself, arguing with himself, sometimes slipping into tones that didn't sound like him at all. These conversations weren't panicked, they were eerily calm, almost contemplative. They reflected a mind splitting along lines that had begun forming in childhood, the obedient son versus the defiant shadow, the quiet giant versus the storm building beneath him. He oscillated between these two selves, sometimes feeling lost in a limbo where neither identity felt entirely real. His mother's criticisms fueled this internal fracturing. She berated him for being lazy, useless, strange, reminding him that he had never achieved anything meaningful. She mocked his attempts at independence. She belittled his small successes. Edmund tried to remain calm, but inside he felt a rising sense of emotional suffocation. He would retreat to his room, sitting in silence for hours, the tension inside him building towards something he didn't yet fully recognize. When the pressure became too much to contain, he would slip into his car and drive into the night, where the darkness felt like the only place he could breathe. And each time he returned home after acting on his compulsions, he became more skillful at erasing the evidence. He planned the routes in advance. He calculated how long it would take to return unnoticed. He kept track of the hours when his mother was least aware, the patterns of her sleep, the nights she drank, the moments when the house fell into silence. He learned how to hide his movements behind the predictability of routine, taking out the trash, doing late-night errands, making long drives he could easily explain. He created a rhythm so stable that no one paid attention to the details of his comings and goings. The police investigation intensified, but Edmund remained on the periphery, blending seamlessly into the background. His ability to maintain normalcy became both his shield and his prison. He lived in fear of being caught, but also in fear of himself, unsure how much longer he could balance the two worlds he moved between. As the months passed, the disappearances multiplied, deepening the community's sense of dread. Students urged one another to stop hitchhiking. Parents called frequently, their voices laced with worry. Women began carrying whistles or walking only in groups. But the cultural norms of the time, trust in strangers, the freedom of movement, still lingered strongly enough to keep people vulnerable. By late 1973, Edmund had constructed a system that allowed him to commit his crimes and cover them efficiently, without drawing attention. Each act reinforced his belief that he could sustain this double life indefinitely. The calmness he displayed during the day grew almost convincing, even to himself. But beneath that calm exterior, the emotional pressure continued to mount, pushed by the volatility of his home life, the loneliness that defined him, and the darkness he could no longer outrun. The secrets he kept at night were becoming heavier. The mask he wore by day was beginning to strain. And the tension between these two realities was inching him steadily toward a breaking point. A breaking point that Santa Cruz would feel before it understood. Chapter 12, The Turning Point, Ruth and the Mother's Friend. As winter settled quietly over Santa Cruz and the cool ocean winds drifted through the eucalyptus-lined streets, Edmund Kemper felt the tension inside him reaching a point he could no longer ignore or bury beneath his calm exterior. Months of living between two identities had worn him down emotionally, and his complicated relationship with his mother had become more suffocating than ever. Clarnell's voice, sharp, dismissive, drunkenly cruel on many nights, filled every corner of the small apartment they shared. She criticized his clothes, his posture, his silence, his existence. Nothing he did was good enough. Nothing he said was taken seriously. And the more she berated him, the more he felt the walls closing in around him, shrinking his world to the dimensions of their shared home and the deep, festering resentment he carried from childhood. That resentment had always been there, simmering in quiet corners of his mind, but now it flared with an intensity he couldn't contain, as though every insult and every belittling comment was another log on a fire burning too hot to control. In this emotional storm, Ruth, one of Clarnell's close friends, entered the picture, kind, trusting, older,
and as unprepared as anyone could be for the darkness quietly consuming their household. Ruth was a frequent visitor at the apartment, a woman who carried the gentle warmth that Edmund had rarely encountered in his life. She had kind eyes, a soft voice, and a patient presence that contrasted sharply with Clarnell's biting manner. She treated Edmund with a politeness that felt foreign to him, asking about his day, offering him small compliments, speaking to him not as a disappointment but as a young man worthy of basic respect. Edmund didn't know how to process it. He wasn't attracted to her, not physically, not romantically, but her kindness was disarming in a way that left him emotionally confused. Part of him liked her presence. Another part of him feared it. And a deeper part, the part shaped by years of humiliation, began to twist that confusion into something darker. Because Ruth's kindness didn't just soothe him, it reminded him of everything he had been denied, everything his mother weaponized against him, everything he believed he could never have. And as winter grew deeper, Ruth's closeness to Clarnell, and therefore to Edmund, became a catalyst for a turning point he had been teetering on the edge of for months. Clarnell, meanwhile, became increasingly hostile as the holidays approached. Her drinking worsened. Arguments flared unpredictably. She accused Edmund of being useless, of being unambitious, of being strange and unlovable. Her words cut deep, reopening old wounds he had carried since childhood, the years locked in a basement, the years spent trying to win approval he would never receive, the years of living in the shadow of a mother who dismissed him as a failure before he even reached adulthood. Her cruelty wasn't new, but Edmund's emotional threshold was weaker now, stretched thin by the duality of his secret life. Every insult pushed him closer to a point of no return, and when Ruth visited, Clarnell often used their conversations as opportunities to humiliate Edmund further, joking about his social ineptitude, mocking his size, blaming him for her failed relationships. The more Clarnell spoke, the more Edmund felt something inside him unraveling, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. It was during one of these visits that the turning point emerged, not in a single moment of violence, but in a gradual, unstoppable shift inside Edmund's mind. He watched his mother and Ruth talking. In the living room, sipping wine, laughing softly, exchanging stories about work and life. The contrast between Ruth's warmth and Clarnell's hostility became unbearable. Ruth treated him like a human being. Clarnell treated him like an inconvenience. And Edmund, sitting quietly at the edge of the room, felt a familiar numbness spreading through him, a numbness that signaled the arrival of the same cold clarity that preceded his worst actions. He didn't think in words. He didn't plan. He didn't debate. The emotional pressure inside him simply reached a point where violence felt inevitable, not as an act of rage but as an act of release, as though the storm inside him had reached a level that demanded some form of expression. And Ruth, unknowingly caught in the crossfire of his life with his mother, became the first to be drawn into that downward spiral. On the night it happened, the apartment was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the refrigerator and the muted breathing of two women asleep after a long evening of conversation. Edmund sat awake in his room, the darkness pressing against his mind like a weight he couldn't shake off. Hours passed. His thoughts became fragmented and disjointed. He replayed memories of his mother's insults, her orders, her mocking tone. He heard Ruth's earlier laughter echoing softly in the apartment. He saw flashes of his childhood, the isolation, the punishments, the scorn. And a numbness spread through him, a coldness that felt almost like peace. He walked into the living room without hesitation, guided not by fury but by an eerie calm. Ruth never woke. She never opened her eyes. She never had a moment to understand what was happening. Edmund carried out the act with the same quiet precision that had defined his earlier crimes, but this time there was no ritual, no escalation of violence, just a cold stillness that felt like the only way to stop the emotional pressure that had been building inside him for years. When it was over, Edmund didn't panic. He didn't rush. He didn't fall apart. He felt the same emptiness he had felt before, the same quiet detachment that often followed his actions. But this time, something was different. This time, the emotional weight didn't lift. Instead, it deepened, settling heavier in his chest. Because this time, he had crossed a boundary he couldn't ignore. Ruth wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a hitchhiker. She was someone connected to his mother, someone who had been kind to him, someone who had inadvertently stepped into the emotional battlefield he lived in every day. And as he stood there in the silent apartment, Edmund realized he was no longer acting out isolated impulses. He wasn't simply responding to internal urges. He was unraveling emotionally, losing control of the delicate balance between his outward persona and the violent shadow he kept hidden. He moved slowly through the next stages, cleaning the apartment, restoring the living room to a state that looked untouched, hiding the evidence with the same meticulousness that defined everything he did. He worked with a precision that would have impressed any forensic investigator, wiping surfaces, removing fibers, eliminating traces, ensuring no sign of Ruth's presence remained. He moved her quietly, methodically, with the strength and control that came naturally to him. And when he was done, he sat alone in the dim kitchen light, listening to the sound of the refrigerator humming, waiting for the sun to rise. Next morning, Clarnell awoke with no idea of what had happened in her own home. She asked where Ruth was. Edmund responded calmly, explaining that she had left early. His mother accepted the explanation without question. The disappearance didn't trouble her, she simply moved on with her morning routine, complaining about work, about the university, about the noise Edmund made as he brewed coffee. Edmund listened quietly, his face expressionless, his mind heavy with the knowledge of what he had done. The emotional distance between him and his mother grew wider in that moment than in any moment before it. He had crossed a threshold. He had acted on impulses that were no longer directed at strangers but at someone inside their circle. And his mother, without knowing it, had become his next emotional fixation. After Ruth, the tension between Edmund and Clarnell spiraled into something far more dangerous. Every insult from her landed deeper. Every argument escalated faster. Every moment in the apartment felt suffocating, as though the air itself was poisoned with decades of resentment and pain. Edmund could no longer separate his emotional wounds from his actions. He began replaying Ruth's death in his mind not with guilt, but with a quiet, unsettling realization that the emotional storm inside him was now fully directed at his mother. For years, she had loomed over his life like a force he couldn't escape. For years, she had shaped his mind, controlled his movements, diminished his sense of self. And now, the culmination of all that pain stood on the horizon, inevitable, silent, and shaped by the same cold clarity that guided his every act of violence. Ruth's death was the turning point. The moment Edmund stopped being merely a predator of opportunity and became someone carrying the weight of years of emotional damage with nowhere left to direct it but the source itself. The apartment grew quieter. The tension heavier. And Edmund, moving through his days with the same outward calm, felt the breaking point approaching like a slow-moving storm. He didn't know when it would come. He didn't know how. But he knew that his mother, his greatest wound, his lifelong tormentor, stood at the center of everything unraveling inside him. The storm had a name now. And Santa Cruz had no idea how close it was to seeing it break. Chapter 13, Climax of Horror, The Death of Clarnell Strandberg. As winter began to loosen its grip on Santa Cruz and the faint promise of spring drifted into the coastal air, Edmund Kemper found himself teetering on the final edge of a lifelong emotional precipice, a place he had been moving toward for years, perhaps even decades, long before anyone around him realized the storm building quietly behind his polite smile and calm voice. His mother, Clarnell Strandberg, remained the center of that storm, its origin, its fuel, and ultimately its unavoidable destination. Their small apartment had become a battlefield, one where every word she spoke seemed to cut at old wounds, reopening memories of the childhood basement, the humiliations, the insults, the punishments, and the emotional isolation that shaped the man Edmund had become. Her voice echoed in his mind constantly now, even when she wasn't speaking, sharp, cold, dismissive, always reminding him of his failures, always reminding him of how she viewed him, not as a son, not as a person, but as an inconvenience she was forced to tolerate. And as the days turned into weeks, Edmund felt the emotional tension in their home tightening around him like a rope slowly constricting, leaving him with fewer breaths, fewer options, and fewer reasons to continue maintaining the fragile balance he had tried to uphold. Clarnell's drinking worsened with each passing week, and with it came the sharp, unpredictable moods that had defined their relationship for years. Some nights, she ignored Edmund entirely, slamming doors and muttering under her breath. Other nights, she directed her full attention toward him, unleashing long, bitter tirades that left him standing silently in the hallway, absorbing every cruel word. She mocked his size, saying he was too big for the apartment, too noticeable, too awkward. She mocked his social failures, reminding him that no woman would ever want him, that he didn't understand people, that he embarrassed her. She mocked the simple things, his clothes, his haircut, the way he stirred his coffee, because she could, because she had always been able to, because Edmund never learned how to defend himself against her. And on the nights when she drank heavily enough to push her anger into cruelty, she accused him of being dangerous, of being strange, of being the kind of man who would never amount to anything. Those accusations stung not because they were new, but because they echoed every insult she had hurled at him in childhood, every message that had shaped his identity as deeply as any scar. After Ruth's death, the tension between them escalated into something more volatile, more immediate. Edmund wasn't the same man he had been even weeks before. The numbness he felt had deepened. The emotional exhaustion had worsened. And the resentment toward his mother had crystallized into a singular, overpowering thought, a realization that his entire life had been shaped by her shadow, her voice, her cruelty. She had mocked him for being quiet, for being awkward, for being strange, yet she was the one who created the silence inside him, who carved the loneliness into his personality with years of emotional neglect. The irony of it, the painful symmetry of it, twisted inside him like a hook, pulling at memories he had tried for years to suppress. He began replaying old scenes in his mind, the nights spent locked in the basement as a child, his mother's new boyfriends being treated with warmth he never received, the harsh glare she gave him when he tried to express himself, the disappointed sighs, the dismissive gestures. And as these memories resurfaced, the emotional pressure inside him swelled, becoming too heavy to contain. One night, after a long shift, Clarnell returned home irritated and drunk. The television flickered with the glow of late-night programs, illuminating her face with a pale, ghostly light as she slumped into her favorite chair. Edmund walked past her on his way to the kitchen, trying to avoid provoking her, but she called out to him in that familiar, sharp tone, mocking, belittling, soaked in contempt. She accused him of being useless, of wasting his life, of being incapable of independence. She told him he was a burden, that he would die alone, that no one wanted him, not even her. Then she made a remark that cut deeper than most, a remark about his father, one that suggested he had inherited the worst qualities of both parents. The words sank into him with a cold finality, as though they were the last thread connecting him to any hope of reconciliation. He retreated to his room that night, but her voice followed him, echoing in his memory, bouncing off the walls of his mind with a growing intensity. He sat in the darkness for hours, the dim streetlight seeping through the blinds, casting faint bars of light across his hands as he stared at them. He felt something inside him break. It wasn't a snap of rage or a sudden explosion. It was a quiet collapse, like a tree falling in a forest with no one there to hear it. The emotional foundation that had supported his attempts at normalcy crumbled beneath him, revealing the depth of the wound he had carried since childhood, a wound his mother had created and reopened again and again until it became the central truth of his existence. And in that quiet collapse, Edmund felt a clarity he had never felt before, a cold certainty that their relationship had reached its end. In the early hours of the morning, when the apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a passing car, Edmund walked out of his room with slow, deliberate steps. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm. He moved down the hallway toward the living room, where his mother slept in her chair, her face softened by the effects of alcohol and exhaustion. The room was dim, lit only by the flicker of the muted television. For a moment, Edmund stood there, watching her, his mind a swirling mixture of numbness, sorrow, and cold determination. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel hatred. What he felt was inevitability, the sense that every moment of his life had led to this point, that the storm inside him could no longer be contained, that the only way to silence the voice that haunted him was to silence the woman who had given it life. He acted with the same chilling calmness that had defined his earlier crimes, but this time the emotional undercurrent was different. Every movement felt slow and deliberate, each second stretching into a heavy, surreal moment that etched itself into his memory. When it was over, Edmund did not rush. He did not panic. He did not collapse. He sat down quietly, breathing steadily, staring at the stillness in front of him. But as the minutes passed, the numbness began to shift into something heavier, something more complex, something that felt like grief tangled with relief, sorrow intertwined with liberation. For the first time in his life, the voice that haunted him, the voice that shaped him, wounded him, controlled him, was silent. But the silence felt unnerving, heavy, strange. He had spent his entire life trying to escape her, trying to earn her approval, trying to understand why she rejected him. Now that she was gone, he stared into the emptiness she left behind, realizing that the emotional landscape of his entire existence had been built around her. Afterward, Edmund moved through the apartment with slow, deliberate efficiency. He cleaned the scene carefully, guided by the same precision he applied to every action. He restored the living room to its usual state, making it look as though nothing unusual had occurred. Then he sat again in the silence, waiting for the emotional collapse he expected, but it didn't come. Instead, he felt a strange clarity, cold, steady, unsettling. The storm inside him had broken, but instead of chaos, he felt only emptiness, like a cavern carved out by years of pain finally hollowing through. But the story did not end there. Hours after his mother's death, Edmund felt another wave of emotional compulsion wash over him, an urge to tie up loose ends, to maintain the stability of his double life for just a little longer, as though part of him still believed he could hide the truth even now. When his mother's close friend, Sally, called later that day, expecting to visit as she often did, Edmund invited her over with a calm voice that hid the turmoil lining his thoughts. Sally had been kind to him in the same quiet way Ruth had. She trusted him. She saw him as gentle, helpful, polite. And when she arrived at the apartment, her concern for Clarnell made her an unexpected witness to a truth Edmund could not allow to surface. What happened next unfolded with the same cold clarity that had guided him before. Sally never made it out of the apartment. Only after both women were gone did the emotional collapse finally begin. The silence in the apartment grew crushing, suffocating, louder than his mother's voice had ever been. Edmund felt the weight of what he had done settling on him with a heaviness that threatened to consume him. The storm he had carried his entire life had broken, but the aftermath was miles beyond what he could endure. He walked through the apartment as if moving through a dream, unsure of what to do next, unsure of what he was now without the emotional anchor, however painful, that had defined his existence. In the days that followed, Edmund knew the end was near. The cycle was over. The masks had shattered. And the man who had lived two lives, one quiet and polite, one violent and hidden, found himself standing at the edge of a truth he could no longer evade. He had crossed the final boundary. And for the first time, he understood that there was only one path left to walk. Chapter 14, Confessions of a Killer, Edmund Kemper speaks. In the days after his mother's death, the small apartment that had once vibrated with tension and bitterness fell into an eerie stillness that Edmund Kemper could not escape, no matter how quietly he moved or how long he sat in the dim light of the kitchen trying to understand the enormity of what he had done. The silence was no longer a relief, it was a weight pressing down on him, magnifying every passing second until he began to feel as though time itself had slowed to a suffocating crawl. The world outside moved on, cars drifted down the street, neighbors walked their dogs, students laughed in the distance, but inside the apartment, everything felt frozen, suspended in a strange limbo between the life he once lived and the consequences that now hovered inevitably on the horizon. As he walked through the rooms, Edmund felt the absence of his mother not as a victory or a release, but as a void so overwhelming that it made him realize how deeply she had dominated his emotional existence. Her voice had shaped him, controlled him, wounded him, and now that it was gone, he found he had nothing left to push against, nothing left to fear, nothing left to hate. Without her presence, without her power, Edmund began to unravel in a way he had never anticipated. He moved mechanically over the next 2 days, the silence growing louder with every hour. He cleaned. He paced. He stood at windows staring out into the world like a stranger observing a life he no longer belonged to. He replayed the events in his mind. Not with pride, not with horror, but with a numb resignation that settled deeper into him with each passing moment. He had crossed every internal boundary he once told himself he could maintain. He had wiped away the final mask. There were no more pretenses left to hold on to. The emotional storm that had fueled him for so long had passed, leaving behind a landscape stripped bare, raw, hollow. It was in that hollow space that a strange, quiet realization formed, a recognition that he did not want to continue running, hiding, or pretending. He understood with chilling clarity that the only direction left was forward, straight into the consequences he had avoided for years. He got into his car with the same calm that had guided him through so many dark nights and began driving aimlessly, moving up and down the highways of California as if trying to distance himself from the life he had destroyed. He showered at truck stops, slept in the car, listened to radio stations crackling in and out of range, all while feeling a growing sense of displacement, as though he had stepped outside of himself entirely. The man behind the wheel didn't feel like Big Ed, the polite regular at the jury room. He didn't feel like the quiet son living under his mother's roof. He didn't even feel like the predator who had stalked backroads and forests under the cover of night. He felt like an empty vessel drifting through a world that no longer had a place for him. The further he drove, the clearer it became, there was no future for him out here. No safety. No identity. No life. Days passed before the breaking point arrived, quietly, almost gently, when Edmund realized that the only way to halt the spiraling collapse inside him was to speak the truth out loud, to hand himself over and explain the unimaginable weight he had carried for years. It was not guilt alone that drove him, it was exhaustion, emotional depletion, and a need for someone, anyone, to finally understand the fractured world that existed inside his mind. He pulled into a small parking lot outside a payphone booth, the cool morning air pressing against the windows, and sat with his hands on the steering wheel for a long time, trying to gather the courage to speak. When he finally stepped out and picked up the receiver, his voice didn't shake. It was steady, calm, almost conversational, as though he were speaking with a friend about a problem he needed help solving. He dialed the Santa Cruz Police Department, the same department whose officers had once drunk beer beside him at the jury room, unaware of the man sitting inches away from them. When the phone was answered, Edmund identified himself clearly, calmly, stating his full name, his location, and the reason for his call. He confessed. Directly. Completely. In detail. The dispatcher didn't believe him at first. Edmund had called once before from Colorado as a teenager, turning himself in after killing his grandparents, only to be dismissed. And now, once again, his calm voice and polite manner made the confession sound absurd, unbelievable, like a prank. But Edmund insisted. He repeated his story with the same steady tone, providing details only the killer could know, locations, timelines, evidence, the apartment address, and most importantly, the truth about his mother. When the police finally took him seriously, Edmund waited beside the booth, leaning against the car with his hands visible, as though he were greeting officers he already knew. When the patrol car pulled up, he didn't run. He didn't argue. He didn't stiffen with fear. He raised his hands calmly and surrendered, his face composed, his eyes tired, his posture almost relieved. The officers approached cautiously, unsure whether the tall, soft-spoken man in front of them could truly be responsible for the horrors they had been investigating. But when they spoke to him, when they heard his calm, articulate explanations, the truth became impossible to deny. At the station, Edmund sat across from detectives he had once casually chatted with at the bar, and for the first time in his life, he opened a door into the fractured landscape of his mind. He described his childhood in a matter-of-fact tone, recounting the cruelty of his mother, the emotional isolation, the punishments, the years spent trying to gain approval he never received. He described the murders with chilling precision, not boasting, not apologizing, simply explaining the mechanics of his double life. He spoke about his compulsions, his loneliness, his resentment, his sense of displacement in the world. And through it all, he maintained the same soft, polite tone that had kept him invisible for so long. Detectives were stunned not just by the brutality of the crimes, but by Edmund's unusually high intelligence and articulate self-awareness. He discussed psychology with ease, analyzing his own behavior with a clarity that startled even seasoned investigators. He did not blame external forces. He did not claim insanity. He described himself as a man shaped by a damaged childhood, driven by compulsions he didn't fully understand, trapped between emotional wounds he could never heal and impulses he could never escape. And when he spoke about his mother, the tone of his voice shifted, still calm, still steady, but layered with decades of pain, hurt, longing, and bitterness. He explained that killing her was the final breaking point, the moment he realized he could no longer continue living with the emotional torment she inflicted upon him. In his mind, turning himself in afterward was the only rational conclusion. The confession lasted hours, long, quiet conversations that revealed a man who understood the reality of his actions yet seemed emotionally distant from them, as though he were recounting someone else's life. Detectives listened in a mixture of disbelief and unease, recognizing that Edmund wasn't simply confessing to avoid consequences, he was confessing because he no longer had the strength to live behind the mask he had constructed. The double life was over. The storm was over. And for the first time, he felt a sense of stillness that wasn't suffocating, but clarifying. By the time Edmund finished speaking, the investigators understood they were in the presence of someone unlike any offender they had ever encountered, not just because of the scale of his actions, but because of the calm, articulate way he unfolded his story. He did not try to deceive them. He did not minimize his crimes. He offered everything, the truth, the motives, the emotional terrain, the darkness, the confusion, the exhaustion. And in the quiet moments between questions, he sat still, hands folded, as though he were finally at rest after years of emotional turmoil. When they placed him in handcuffs and led him to a holding cell, Edmund did not resist. He didn't even look afraid. In some strange, unsettling way, he looked almost peaceful. Because the mask was gone. The voice of his mother was gone. The double life was gone. And for the first time in his adult life, Edmund Kemper felt that he no longer had to hide the darkness he had spent so many years buried beneath a polite smile. He had told the truth. And now, he was ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 15, The Legacy of Darkness, How the Co-ed Killer Changed America. After Edmund Kemper's quiet, almost surreal confession, the shockwaves rippled far beyond the confines of the Santa Cruz Police Department, stretching across California, then across the country, then across the growing landscape of American criminal psychology, leaving behind a legacy that would influence investigators, forensic experts, and behavioral scientists for decades to come. When word spread that the towering, soft-spoken Big Ed, the friendly bar regular who chatted casually with local officers, was in fact the man behind the string of disappearances that had terrified Santa Cruz, the community struggled to reconcile the two images. People who had seen him every week at the jury room felt a creeping sense of disbelief. Neighbors who once nodded politely now found themselves replaying old interactions through the lens of hindsight, searching for clues that were never visible. Students at UCSC whispered about the quiet giant who had walked among them unnoticed. And across the nation, people leaned closer to their radios and newspapers, trying to understand how someone who looked so ordinary, who behaved so gently, who appeared so harmless, could be capable of such darkness. It was one of the first times America truly confronted the baffling reality that a serial killer could hide in plain sight not by avoidance, but by blending in seamlessly with the world around him. Kemper's trial became a moment of national fascination, not because the outcome was uncertain, his extensive confession made that clear, but because of the eerie calmness with which he navigated every step of the process. He sat in the courtroom politely, answering questions with articulate clarity, displaying a level of intelligence and self-analysis that unnerved even seasoned professionals. Reporters noted how he seemed more like an assistant to the prosecution than a man fighting for his freedom, offering details, explanations, and insights that most offenders would hide. Some said he spoke about his actions the way a mechanic might describe a broken engine, methodical, detached, oddly technical. Others noted the discomfort in the room each time his deep, measured voice echoed across the courtroom, describing the internal conflicts, emotional wounds, and compulsions that shaped his life. In a time when the psychological understanding of serial killers was still in its infancy, Kemper stood as a living portrait of duality, high intelligence paired with emotional devastation, politeness wrapped around rage, self-awareness intertwined with uncontrollable compulsion. For many investigators, it was the first time they considered the possibility that understanding the mind of a killer required far more than tracking patterns or collecting physical evidence. It required stepping into the emotional and psychological terrain that shaped their behaviors long before the crimes ever occurred. One of the most influential aspects of Kemper's legacy emerged not in courtroom drama, but behind prison walls, where he became one of the most studied serial offenders in American history. Psychologists, criminologists, and behavioral analysts recognized immediately that his intelligence, memory, and willingness to talk made him a rare source of insight into the psychology of violent offenders. He did not withhold details. He did not evade introspection. He described his thoughts, emotions, impulses, and childhood wounds with remarkable clarity. For the FBI's emerging Behavioral Science Unit, an organization that would later become famous for pioneering the field of criminal profiling, Kemper became a foundational case study. Agents traveled to interview him, not because they trusted him, but because they understood how valuable his self-awareness could be in shaping future investigations. He explained not only what he did, but why he did it, how he selected victims, how he suppressed suspicion, how he maintained normalcy, and how the emotional trauma of his early life shaped the compulsions that later emerged. He became, unintentionally, a teacher, one whose lessons were extracted from some of the darkest recesses of the human mind. And while his crimes were horrific, the information he provided allowed law enforcement to develop early frameworks that helped identify behavioral patterns in other offenders, ultimately aiding in the capture of future killers who hid behind similar masks. Yet beyond the academic world, Kemper's story reshaped public perception of safety in ways that would alter daily life for generations. Before his arrest, hitchhiking, especially among college students, had been common, even culturally accepted. But as details of his crimes spread, parents across the country warned their children against getting into strangers' cars. Universities increased campus patrols. Women banded together, walking in groups, avoiding isolated roads. And a broader awareness emerged that predators did not always look like villains from a movie, sometimes they looked like neighbors, co-workers, friends. Sometimes they were polite. Sometimes they were quiet. Sometimes they were the last person anyone expected. Kemper's case forced America to confront an uncomfortable truth: danger did not always come from the shadows, it sometimes came from the familiar. Inside prison, Kemper adapted to a life of rigid routine, serving his sentence quietly, offering interviews and cooperating with psychological studies while maintaining the same calm composure that had defined him for years. He became known to staff as intelligent and cooperative, a model inmate in terms of behavior, though one whose past made him an object of morbid fascination. Over time, he even participated in prison programs such as recording audiobooks for the blind, reading thousands of hours of literature in his deep, steady voice. For some, this added another unsettling layer to his story: how easily the same voice that once lured victims with gentle politeness could now narrate children's stories intended to comfort. It was another reminder of the duality that had always defined him. But beneath the routines, interviews, and outward calm, Kemper remained fully aware of the gravity of his actions. In rare moments of honesty, he admitted that if given the chance to walk free, he feared he might kill again, not out of desire, but out of the same compulsions that had shaped his past. He expressed remorse at times, though always through the lens of introspection rather than emotion, acknowledging the destruction he caused while maintaining a detached, almost clinical tone. Some saw his remorse as genuine. Others believed it was simply another mask. But regardless of interpretation, his reflections left a lasting imprint on the field of criminal psychology. They served as a stark reminder of how deeply childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and psychological fragmentation could shape a human being's path. As years passed, Kemper's story remained etched into the cultural fabric of America, not glorified, but studied, analyzed, dissected. Documentaries, books, and interviews explored the timeline of his life, the complexities of his personality, the failures of the systems around him, and the chilling ease with which he blended into ordinary life. His case became a benchmark for understanding how serial killers think, how they operate, and how easily they can move among unsuspecting communities. And for Santa Cruz, a place that endured 3 separate serial killers in the same era, the memory of that dark period became a permanent chapter in its history. For many, the most unsettling part of Kemper's legacy is not the scale of his crimes, but the contradictions embedded within him. He was intelligent, articulate, polite, even gentle in appearance. He helped neighbors. He fixed cars. He held doors open. He drank beer with police officers. He read books aloud for the visually impaired. Yet behind that soft-spoken exterior lived a storm forged in childhood, fueled by emotional wounds, and unleashed in ways that forever altered the understanding of criminal behavior. His story forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about trauma, mental illness, misogyny, familial dysfunction, and the hidden fractures that can shape a life long before the world realizes what has taken root. In the end, Edmund Kemper remains a figure who embodies both the terrifying unpredictability of human nature and the profound importance of understanding the psychological roots of violence. His story is not one of monsters lurking in the night, but of pain concealed behind polite smiles, of emotional wounds festering beneath quiet exteriors, of a man shaped by forces he could not control and choices he ultimately made alone. And while his actions will forever define him, the lessons drawn from his life continue to influence investigators, psychologists, and students of true crime to this day, reminding us that understanding darkness is essential not to excuse it, but to prevent it from rising again. As the years continue their steady march and the world moves further away from the events of the 1970s, Kemper remains behind the thick walls of prison, living out the remainder of his days in quiet obscurity. But his impact, chilling, complex, and deeply unsettling, echoes far beyond the cell that holds him, reminding us that beneath the surface of ordinary life, the darkest shadows sometimes hide in the most ordinary faces.